Welcome to the second annual Natal Conference. There's about twice as many of you here as there were when we got together in 2023. Since then, our worlds have come together a lot closer. The mood at last year's conference was of very different tribes cautiously coming together, realizing they had a lot in common and hungry to talk. And I'm not going to pretend that we saw it coming, but this crowd, the crowd here, clearly anticipated the coalition that would win the White House a year later. And I suspect that's why we had so many journalists request to participate this year, because there's something about this issue that explains our political moment. Now, this conference has no partisan agenda, and we're not affiliated with anyone in the administration, but the topic of demographic decline clearly matters to Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, and many others in the Trump administration, which means that the great ideas developed here can get a hearing that would not have been possible last year. It's also clear that the issue of demographic decline has entered the mainstream. Last year, we had many academics tell us they couldn't afford to touch this issue in public, but increasingly the statistics are undeniable. Since the last time we met, birth rates have fallen further in all but 10 of 195 countries. Regardless of your politics, whether you intend to raise a family or not, this issue is going to matter to you in the next 15 years. When pundits talk about negative population growth or degrowth, there's an assumption that it's just growth but backwards, that you just rewind to where you were when you were a smaller society. But that's not how it works at all. The value of every asset in the economy, from your 401k to your mortgage, to the company that pays your salary, to the dollars in your checking account, is priced on the assumption of long-term returns, economic growth. And there's only two ways an economy can grow. It can grow by adding more workers or by making existing workers more efficient. And to be clear, it doesn't have to be stratospheric, runaway, exponential growth. In fact, if you just had a stable population, a population not in decline, then you could say, well, we get a little bit smarter every year, and so there's this promise of returns if we invest, and so people keep investing and capital keeps flowing. But if the population decline is so drastic that you can't do that, people stop building, they stop investing, and the economy seizes up. We can see this in Japan, where despite all the effort they've put into making their workers more efficient, educating their workforce, investing in automation, they've experienced zero economic growth in 30 years. Their economy went from being about 70% of the size of the U.S. in 1995 to about 10% today. All the breathless articles about China's dominance that you read in the news now could have been written about Japan in 1990, and China is on the exact same demographic trajectory as Japan was then. As their population gets older, the economy drags, social class hardens, and young workers become less interested in and less capable of stable family formation. This is a self-reinforcing problem. It gets worse as it gets worse. And Japan's troubles are still accelerating. The government is deeply in debt. They're running out of tools to stimulate their economy, and they're capitulating on immigration. Likewise, South Korea is more free, more prosperous, more efficient, performing better than North Korea on every conceivable metric except fertility. And to put the gap in perspective, at current rates, every 100 North Korean women will have 70 great-grandchildren, because they're actually also in population decline. But every 100 South Korean women is expected to have 4. And that's if the gap remains stable, but it's actually growing. So that certainly doesn't recommend anything about the North Korean model of doing things. But if they outnumber the South Koreans 18-1, and the South Koreans are left trying to operate infrastructure and defense apparatus meant for a population 25 times the size, it's obvious who will have their way on the Korean peninsula. If you don't get this question right, it doesn't matter what else you get right. The future belongs to those who show up. But that's all abstract. I'm not here for the South Koreans, although I like South Koreans. I'm not here to prop up the housing market or the Social Security Trust Fund. I'm here for my kids. I have 6, 4 boys, 2 girls. Oh, and one on the way. Thank you for that. Yeah. And to the extent that I care about, these line charts and bar graphs at all, it's to the extent that they describe something about the world that my kids are going to live in. And so I think about whether my kids will be stuck, like young Japanese people, working longer hours for less pay to prop up collapsing infrastructure and an ever-growing population of the aged. I think about whether they will live in a strong, cohesive country or a weak, sick, aging country that crumbles under the weight of its own contradictions. But more importantly, I look at why this demographic crisis is unfolding. The struggles of individual men and women to connect, to trust each other, to build something together. How hard it is to find love and connection in our present. And I can't imagine doing nothing and just leaving my kids to figure that out on their own. Because my kids, like most kids, want to grow up and have families of their own someday. And that's the real puzzle here. If you ask people, you find this enormous and growing population of people who say they don't plan to have children and in some sense don't want children. But having children isn't a hobby for some weird little subculture. It's as close as you can get to the root of what it means to be human. Whatever your story about what human beings are and where they come from and what they're for, if we're built to do anything at all, we're clearly built to fall in love and have children and raise them. Besides which, right alongside the data showing collapsing individual intention to start a family, we see that desired fertility and ideal family size for men and women are pretty stable at 2 or 3 kids, right above replacement. Which means that if everyone got what they wanted, there wouldn't be any fertility problem. And there also wouldn't be massive runaway growth either, which is incredibly convenient. We don't have to make anybody do anything they don't actually want to do. We just have to help them get what they want. So this should all be very easy, right? There's a civilizational catastrophe coming, and the way to solve it is to have sex. Like, that's got to be the easiest pitch in history. So why do we have people practically clawing their eyes out? They're so furious that people are advocating for this. Well, the unspoken assumption on both sides of the natalism debate is that falling fertility is the inevitable consequence of the sexual revolution, which means that anyone raising concerns about falling birth rates must be secretly conniving to roll it all back. And for their part, conservative commentators often do blame it on the sexual revolution, or video games, or porn, or the failure of good men to step up, and they basically do want to roll it all back. So both sides implicitly accept this frame that the crisis is just the price of freedom, that if you give people a choice, particularly women, they just don't want to fall in love and get married and have babies. But if you talk to people about their aspirations and you look at their actual behavior, you don't see them happily ignoring family life and love. Instead, you see tremendous effort and hunger, and heartbreak, and frustration. Of course people want to find love. And when they fall in love, they want babies. They want it just like they want food and warmth and oxygen. They respond to it chemically. It's literally the most natural thing in the world to want. The question is whether they can find it and whether it will cost them more than they can afford. Which is not just to say the rent is too damn high, although that's part of the puzzle. But people in other places and times have managed to have kids under much more difficult material conditions. It's more like, can I afford the risk of divorce, of dependency, of vulnerability, haggling over custody and child support? Those are the costs that have really gone through the roof in the last decades. And when we attack the sexual revolution, what many women hear is that they should be expected to just eat those costs and submit to being tyrannized and hurt and humiliated for civilization or for the economy or something. And I'm not going to talk out of both sides of my mouth. I think the sexual revolution has been a disaster. It destroys everything it touches. It makes both men and women unbearably lonely and miserable and crazy. But it's not because it gave people what they wanted. When young people say they don't want this basic human need, what they're saying is they've accepted life without it. And that's an obvious tragedy. I have 2 daughters, and of course, I don't want them to be tyrannized or hurt or humiliated. As a side note, I think part of the derangement of the discourse between men and women is generated by the fact that not enough women are raising little boys, and not enough men are raising little girls. There are things about men and women in general and about yourself that you can't really understand until you've seen all these little parts of yourself shuffled around in the minds and hearts of your kids. This is a category of knowledge that used to be almost universal among adults, totally intuitive, went without saying. But yes, of course, I want my daughters to be loved and respected and to have rich intellectual lives. I just don't think the way to make that happen is to build a world where they're never vulnerable. Because the only way you can eliminate vulnerability and dependency is to abolish love. And that's what all this comes down to. Having children is the ultimate expression of love precisely because they put your heart on the line. They tie 2 people's destinies together irrevocably. They provide tremendous meaning at the cost of tremendous vulnerability for both men and women. And the sexual revolution is basically modern liberal society's attempt to take the other side of that trade, to build a world without love, without dependency, without trust. And it turns out that means a world without children, and eventually a world without modern liberal societies. So it's not that I think the 1950s were so great, or that I think we could even get back there if we wanted to. But clearly these are the stakes. We can either figure out some new arrangement, some way to make the leap and love each other again, or we can die alone as individuals, as communities, and as a civilization. And I don't pretend to know what that new solution will look like. At the end of the day, I'm just a guy with a blog. But I have to try because I can't let my kids grow up in a world this cynical and barren. It seemed like the right place to start was just to get people together to talk about it. And it turns out that the people who care about this issue are just incredibly bright and thoughtful and driven to help. The journalists in attendance will know from our conversations that I've hesitated to call this thing we're doing a movement because it's just common sense. Almost anybody that you explain this problem to is a pronatalist by default. But I think there's something very special about the people who've been drawn to this issue. It seems to bring out the best in people, their longest vision, their most noble impulses. And we have a powerful opportunity this year in particular to have conversations that can become the executive orders, the white papers, the grant proposals that can change the course of nations in the 2030s. I think most of us, myself included, are mainly just looking for answers for our own families. But sometimes bigger problems get solved that way. So I just encourage you all, as we come into the unconference portion, to bring your A game. We've built lots of time for you to talk into the agenda because we need your perspective. You're going to hear ideas today that you don't agree with. You're going to hear ideas I don't agree with. But the great thing about tackling a problem this enormous is that it's pretty hard to come in feeling like you've got all the answers. So if it's anything like last year, it'll be from a place of clear goodwill and good faith and honest curiosity. And I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Malcolm and Simone Collins, Every Life, the American Principles Project, Passage Press, and the Howdy Doody Good Times Foundation. This event absolutely would not have happened without your support. I'd like to thank, first and foremost, of course, my wife, who is the only reason any of this makes sense to me, and for giving me children and giving me this perspective that I think is so important and the beauty that I want to share with the world. And also my co-founders, Drew Gorham and David Moore, who took a huge leap of faith in launching the conference with me last year, Luke, our event producer, the speakers who helped us get the word out and offered copies of their books, all our volunteers, our venues and crew, and of course, all of you who gave your time and money to bring this issue to the forefront of a global conversation. Thank you.